Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sam. I'm the U.S. coordinator for the Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle, and this is the right to resist on international humanitarian law and the right to take up arms. I'm seeing folks introduce themselves in the chat. We have people all over Europe. We have people in the US. I'm seeing that we have friends joining us from the Philippines. So thank you, everyone. Please feel free to continue to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and organization and where you're calling in from. So we will actually start out today with a cultural offering from Art for the People. We have two poems, one from Kativon and one from Moon, both from Art for the People based in Florida here in the US. Their goal is to promote the creation, of political art exposing capitalism. So we'll start with a couple poems and then get into the webinar.
The walls. The walls in my room are shaking, vibrating. I'm imagining them like this. I'm picturing a child in bed, waiting to die. But I have seen her face. I don't think she's waiting to die. She is not waiting to be killed. She is waiting for her body to stop shaking. I'm picturing a child transforming, pain becoming action. I'm watching the empire try to meet resistance. But resistance can't help but demand a voice. A child changes slowly. A person changes form. Roots dig into the rubble. The metal of missiles course through a person. They have seen something the empire could never imagine. They have seen the edge of its influence. They can envision how its end springs forth from its own making. I don't think she's waiting to die. I think she's waiting for her body to stop shaking. But it is not the same body. It will not be the same tomorrow either. The child is changing. The world conforms to the edges of the child. The child feels for the contours of the world. There is an edge. The empire has a horizon, and the child is going to find it.
The revolution will not be televised, yet genocide is flashing before our eyes, every day getting desensitized to Palestinian fathers kissing their martyred children goodbye. How can a people be so dehumanized? Kids with hopes and dreams, dismissed as human shield casualties. Thousands of kidnapped hostages like Ahed Tamimi, held captive by the racist Zionist entity. Refugee camps in people's own homeland, reduced to rubble for settler land grabs. Israel gaslighting to excuse the horror. That's not a hospital, just a Hamas headquarter. And everyone who's a critic is just anti-Semitic. It's time for the international masses to heed, the horn blaring the words of Ghassan Kanafani, to see the Palestinian cause as one for every revolutionary, learning from the legacy of the PFLP to clearly identify and strike our enemies through scientific socialist theory. Israel, Zionism, and world imperialism, three heads of one beast, and us masses residing in the belly are getting ready to claw our way out by any means necessary. Building the forces of unity we need to sabotage the US war machine, from Palestine to the Philippines. For now, a ceasefire until we seize this whole capitalist world empire, so that never again means no more Nakbas for anybody. And from the river to the sea, we're taking down every settler colony. Free Palestine.
Wow, what a way to kick us off here. Thank you so much, Art for the People based in Florida in the US. So again, welcome everyone. This is the right to resist on international humanitarian law and the right to take up arms. We are hosted by the Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. So why are we here today? Many of us, I'm sure all of us actually, are seeing the images of destruction coming out of Gaza and also seeing the unprecedented resistance that's happening there. Palestine and the Philippines are only two places in the world where there is armed resistance happening for national liberation. There are unprecedented struggles for national liberation and socialism happening all over the world. Kurdistan, Myanmar, West Papua are just a few. Um, and those who engage in armed resistance for national liberation and against their own oppression are often labeled as terrorists. But international humanitarian law actually enshrines the right to resist against occupation and oppression. And so we're here to talk more about that today and learn more about that today. So our first speaker today is Eevee Garcia. Eevee will be speaking on the upcoming International People's Tribunal on May 17th and 18th in Europe. It's titled Katarungan, the Filipino People Against the US Government and the Marcos and Duterte Regimes. Eevee Garcia is global coordinator of the Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle and supports the coordination of global FFPS campaigns with the members. He learned about the struggle in the Philippines through anti-imperialist activism and has visited the Philippines as part of the International Observers Mission during the flawed elections of 2022 that saw the restoration of a Marcos in office. As part of his solidarity work for the Filipino people, he is part of organizing the upcoming International People's Tribunal. So I will pass it over to you, Eevee.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you for that introduction. As Sam has mentioned already, I'll be talking a bit about the upcoming International People's Tribunal, which will be happening in May 17 and May 18. And I'll discuss a bit of why there is this need for a tribunal, and also what is it actually, and what can people do to support, and also a bit more on the international solidarity work with Filipino people. So, as we see that both the Marcos and Duterte regimes are guilty of alleged war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law, this deserves international condemnation by the international community. And at the same time, there's also the context of US imperialism, which is funding and directing wars across the globe under the guise of counterinsurgency, and is doing this in the Philippines as well. So to this backdrop, the Filipino people are now exercising its right to try the perpetrators of these war crimes and to seek justice for that with the help of international community. So just a few examples of possible violations of international humanitarian law by both regimes are the incredible amount of extrajudicial killings during the war on drugs under the US Duterte regime. Over 30,000 people were killed during this regime without any process. And actually, these killings are still continuing. And the drug war is still continuing under Marcos as well. And next to that, there have also been clearly politically motivated extrajudicial killings, both under Duterte and the Marcos regime. And then also there is the grave cases of enforced disappearances, where the families of the victims still don't know what has happened to their loved ones. So these happen as well consistently under the Duterte Marcos regime. And it's supported and condoned by the US as well. And as well as a huge number of bombings, which not only affect directly all the communities where these happen. These have only intensified under the Duterte and Marcos regimes as well. And so these are just a few examples of possible violations of international humanitarian law, which the International People's Tribunal will look into. So for those of you who like me, maybe for the first time hear about an International People's Tribunal, I'll talk a bit about what it actually is. So it's quite different from traditional courts. It actually receives its mandate from the toiling masses of workers, peasants, and other democratic forces who are usually deprived of their rights. And these are being represented by their national and social liberation movements. So unlike the traditional courts or existing international institutions, those other institutions, they are easily influenced by imperialist interests. I think we can see that all over the world, even with, for example, the ICC, there is flaws there as well with the heavy influence of imperialism. So the People's Tribunal is quite different because it's a court of a people's opinion. So its findings carry significant political and moral weight as they facilitate a platform for the victims of violations and advocates and national and social liberation movements to seek justice and accountability on their oppressors. So in this, it follows a very long history of people's tribunals that have shaped the international public opinion and that have tried various regimes on crimes against humanity. This upcoming IPT is also a bit special in the sense that it will be really a war crimes tribunal and also address the extremely relevant role of US counterinsurgency strategy in the Philippines. Because without the heavy hand of the US, the Marcos and Duterte regime would have a hard time staying in power as well. And so the People's Tribunal will follow a structured legal process. It will have due process, it will have hearing of evidence, of live and recorded testimonies of witnesses of the alleged violations. And it will also have a panel of esteemed jurors presiding over the tribunal who will also judge and present a verdict as well. Now, when we talk about this verdict, it's not in that sense legally binding, but it still contributes to the documentation of the historical truths and shape international public opinion. And it can be a basis for future legal action. And so it's really a people's court, no? So it's the people that are wielding this justice. So the upcoming tribunal will examine violations both to the means and methods of warfare, but also to the objects and subject of attack. So it will look into extrajudicial and summary killings of civilians, evidence of torture, enforced disappearances, and many, many more violations. So currently, the Marcos Duterte ruling clique still continues with complete disregard of international humanitarian law and with support and direction from the US government. So it's very urgent and also timely that we give space for this tribunal. So let's talk a bit about how we can support this effort. So it's an important part is also really raising awareness about the importance of the IPT. Because as a People's Tribunal, we're still trying to also broaden its reach and to really have this influence on the international community as well. So if you want to help out, it would really be great if you could try to talk to your contacts about it, reach out to media, both progressive and mainstream media, and new and traditional media as well. But also very important, you could organize local alliances or events to support the tribunal, including webinars such as this one, or fora, discussion groups, and also mobilizing to join protest actions and political demonstrations. And very important as well to raise funds for the expenses of the IPT. There can be a lot of creative ways of doing fundraisers, and you can also support online by following this link, the tiny URL of Donate IPT. This will be very important to support the witnesses that have to travel to the IPT to present their cases, and also all the other expenses that might come up with that. So the main conveners of this IPT will be Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. We're convening this IPT to create a venue for the Filipino people to try the US Marcos and US Duterte administrations. Now we say US Marcos and US Duterte because both of these administrations are heavily supported and directed by the US government. So in this International People's Tribunal, and by convening this, we also support exposing the true natures of these regimes to the international community to also isolate them further. Because especially also Marcos has really been trying to go around, visit a lot of world leaders to try and present an image of a united Philippines and supposedly of a better Philippines. But he has continued systematically with all the violations that have also been done under the Duterte regime. And the results and findings of the IPT will also further expose these war crimes that have been happening in the Philippines, underlining as well the Filipino people's right to actually fight against this oppressive and exploitative regime and to fight for liberation. So this is all part also of our broader efforts of supporting the Filipino people and their just struggle for liberation. So as FFPS, we also reiterate that for more than 50 years, the Filipino people have been waging a brave and militant struggle for a just and lasting peace. And when we talk about a just and lasting peace, it's not just peace in name, it's not just the absence of hostilities, but it's really the realization of genuine national and democratic liberation. And we see that these aspirations and the Filipino people that are struggling are really represented by the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, the Revolutionary United Front that the Filipino people have been able to establish in their struggle. And so for us as peace-loving people and as anti-imperialists, we really should support the Filipino people and all anti-imperialist forces in their just and very urgent struggles against oppression and exploitation. I hope that gave you a short overview over the upcoming IPT as well. And if you're interested in joining Friends, please visit our website or message us in any other ways. And then I'll give it back to Sam.
Okay, thank you so much, Eevee, for that very thorough explanation of the International People's Tribunal coming up. And so if folks want to learn more about that, you can follow FFPS or People's Tribunal on social media, Instagram and Facebook, or go to peoplestribunal.net or ffps.info. I also want to encourage people to utilize the Q&A function here. If you have any questions for Eevee or any of our speakers coming up, we will have a Q&A portion at the end, so please feel free to drop your questions there. So our next speaker is Suzanne Adely. Suzanne is the president of the National Lawyers Guild, a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and a longtime labor and community organizer. Through organizations like the NLG and IADL, she has worked to use the law to expose and build accountability for U.S. imperialist policies. Suzanne is on the coordinating committee of the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, co-convenes Labor for Palestine, and is on the steering committee of the International People's Tribunal, which Eevee just spoke about, on U.S. imperialism. Suzanne is also the co-director of a binational alliance supporting the 33 worker organizations in the food economy. So I will pass it over to you, Suzanne. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me today. I wanted to just begin by talking a little bit about the situation in Gaza at the moment, because it's a kind of important context for this discussion of resistance. And I think that many of you know or have heard that Gaza has one of the world's highest population densities, and the majority of its population is refugees from other parts of Palestine who have been displaced over decades by Zionist colonial violence. And Gaza has been placed under a violent, horrific siege, economic siege since 2008. And it has been the target of periodic genocidal bombings in 2008-9, 2014. And some of you might recall that around 2021, there was this very sort of important people's movement called the Great March of Return that was met with horrific violence. And now many of us are seeing played out live streams in front of our eyes, massacre after massacre take place in Palestine, and we are hearing from the mouths of Israeli themselves the genocidal intent of these bombings. The latest being referred to as the Flower Massacre, when the starving population of Gazans who've been told that there was flour available for them to access went to the site where the aid was supposed to be provided, and Israel started to open fire, and over 100 Palestinians were killed again. And so, we've seen in the past few months the slaughter of over 30,000 Palestinians, horrific injuries, millions displaced and being starved. And this is part of a long history of colonial violence against the Palestinians that really began in the late 19th century, which is kind of a history that many of the people who are talking about what's going on in Gaza today choose to forget. And so I think it's just sort of a very, very important to begin with that. And I'm going to go into talking about the law, but I just want to take a moment to honor Aaron Bushnell, who was a member of the U.S. military Air Force, who engaged in an extreme act of sacrifice because of in solidarity with the Palestinian people, with the people of Gaza, and particularly because he knew that his government is directly complicit in this genocide. And those kinds of acts of bravery have really, I think, inspired, and particularly from young people and members sort of like of these kinds of institutions like the U.S. military, who kind of realize what these institutions are actually engaged in. These kinds of acts of sacrifice, of acts of resistance are really inspiring. And so I just wanted to take a minute to honor him. So the illegal occupation of Palestine represents an unlawful use of force, an act of aggression. And the particular occupation that I'm referring to began in 1967 on the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. But actually, the colonial violence began much before the official sort of occupation of those territories. In 1948, as I said, the colonization project began much earlier, with the beginning of settlements of European colonizers in the late 19th century. That slowly became acts of violence against the Palestinian indigenous people and their displacement. And in 1948, when the state of Israel was established, which Palestinians and Arabs refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe, over 500 Palestinian villages were destroyed, numerous massacres took place, and today there is a Palestinian refugee population of about 5 million who were internally displaced within Palestine and also in refugee camps in other Arab countries, who also have their own trauma of being targets of colonial violence, and who themselves have a right under international law to return to their homes in Palestine. So I just want to give that context as I talk about the occupation, which is specific to when the law refers to the occupation, they're speaking specifically to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza that began in 1967, when actually the colonial violence is much older than that. So the illegal occupation of Palestine represents an unlawful use of force, an act of aggression, and recent positions by several reputable entities, including the UN Commissions of Inquiry on Palestine and Israel, the current and former UN Special Rapporteurs on Palestine, and a study released by the official UN Committee on Palestine and Israel, alongside numerous relevant academic studies, legal academic studies, deem the occupation unlawful and an ongoing act of aggression and a continuous wrongful act. And this question of the legality of the occupation is also under consideration currently under the ICJ case that South Africa brought to The Hague under the Genocide Convention. As the occupying belligerent power, as the aggressor, Israel has no right to self-defense, whereas the right of self-defense for Palestinians is clear. In 2004, the ICJ delivered an advisory opinion on the apartheid wall in the West Bank, countering Israeli claims of constructing the wall in self-defense by stating that this right is irrelevant based on the fact that Israel exercises effective control over the occupied territories. Therefore, it's Israel that is required not to suppress resistance rather than the opposite. And as long as the illegal occupation persists, it constitutes, according to international responsibility rules, a continuous wrongful act, thus preserving Palestine's right to resist as continuous. Dozens of resolutions by the UN General Assembly support national liberation movements in their struggle for independence and self-determination, including armed struggle. For instance, Resolution 2105 of 1965 condemned Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau. And at the time of the resolution's adoption, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde had officially engaged in armed liberation struggle. The General Assembly in the same resolution requested all states to provide material and moral assistance to the national liberation movements in colonial territories, to self-defense for the occupied state or the occupied people. Also, the Declaration of Friendly Relations, Resolution 2625 of 1970, which reflects customary law, recognizes the right to resist against foreign forcible actions that deprive people of their right to self-determination. The UN recognized the right to self-determination for the Palestinian people previously. It states that every state must refrain from any forcible action that deprives the people of their right to self-determination, freedom, and independence. And it became much clearer even in 1982 when UN General Assembly Resolution 3743 affirmed the legitimacy of the struggle for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. This resolution openly recognized the right to use force against foreign illegal occupation, which it considers a serious threat to international peace and security, recalling the cases of Namibia and Palestine. Furthermore, the additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, to which Palestine acceded in 2014, joining over 160 countries, and its Article 1.4 classifies conflicts in which people are fighting against alien occupation and racist regimes as armed conflicts. Individuals engaging in such fighting, if captured, should be afforded the status of prisoners of war, meaning their fighting is legitimate. Historical evidence overwhelmingly supports that self-determination is rarely achieved without the use of force in armed struggle. And failing to acknowledge resistance movements would lead to an illogical situation. Alien occupations would go unchallenged, rendering any resistance against their illegal status illegal itself. Finally, it's worth emphasizing that the right to resist in self-defense is subject to the rules of international humanitarian law. Now, in that, and I think that what we're sort of experiencing is that the people who are then making this point that Palestine's resistance is subject to international humanitarian law and must sort of be exercised in a way that practices, the laws of necessity, proportionality, and imminency. I think our current experience is that those who are sort of emphasizing those points are really parties and individuals and scholars who want to use those points to debunk the legitimacy of the Palestinian resistance, right? Because all the evidence that we see since October 7th is that the violation of the laws of necessity, proportionality really are being violated by Israel, right? And there have been some very strong propaganda campaigns trying to prove that the Palestinian resistance fighters are acting in a way that are violating these laws under IHL. And those have been propaganda campaigns like the beheading of babies, right? Which the US media reinforced, which had been completely debunked. There's also been a major propaganda campaign that has been debunked over and over, and most recently, quite strongly by the publication The Intercept, showing that the New York Times published a story based on zero evidence of this narrative of mass rapes against Israeli women. And so, we're seeing a concerted effort, particularly, out of Israel, but also in the Western media, trying to show ways in which the Palestinians are violating the laws of necessity, violating IHL, violating laws of proportionality, that have consistently been debunked. And speaking as an Arab American, somebody who's sort of like plugged into the not just the US base, but the broader Arab community, is that we also, and this is, I'm moving away from the discussion of the law right now to a discussion of like our moral sort of obligation, to support Palestinian resistance, right? We talk about in our community, in our organizations, like in our families, right? We talk about what's been going on since October 7th in very different ways than the West talks about it, or even folks who are engaged in solidarity and calling for ceasefires talk about it. What we saw happen on October 7th was something that, obviously, scared us very deeply, because we knew that the operation on October 7th would be followed by horrific violence, right? But many of us saw October 7th as a moment, a historical moment in which the Palestinians engaged in what was an important and necessary and legitimate resistance operation, in support of their people, in support of their liberation struggle. Because, without that, what was going to happen was a slow genocide against the Palestinian people. And, the one thing that's really standing in the way of the complete annihilation of the Palestinian people, whether that be in Gaza or in the West Bank, or in the stripping of the rights of the millions of Palestinian refugees, is the resistance itself, the resistance in Gaza and the resistance in the West Bank. And so we choose to talk about it as legitimate resistance, and we choose to talk about what's currently happening as not just genocide, is not just sort of us seeing Palestinians as victims, right? Palestinians are engaged as there is the right in their liberation struggle, and that's something that we need to, as much as it's hurting us to see the violence of what's happening, it's also something that we need to celebrate, and it's a discussion that we need to also normalize. And so I was hoping, and I don't know if I have the opportunity to play a small clip from a video. Is that possible?
Yes, I believe you should be able to do that.
Okay, great. And so I actually just want to play part of the challenge to sort of normalizing discussions about Palestinian resistance, especially in the United States, is that there's this kind of like cloud, there's kind of like this, maybe like a lack of familiarity with who the Palestinian, resistance is, right? And really, what their goals for liberation are. And I thought it would be good to hear a clip from a doctor, who is Dr. Bassem Naim, who is formerly a member of the government of Gaza, and a member of Hamas. And this is an interview that he did with an organization called Masar Badil, who has been doing a series of interviews with representatives from Palestinian resistance, as well as Ansarallah in Yemen. And I encourage you to go look on their page. They're very much a kind of a Europe-based organization that represents young Palestinian people on the left. I encourage you to go see in their page to, to have an opportunity to view these discussions with representatives and leadership of the Palestinian resistance themselves, to sort of like try to understand exactly, exactly who they are, because I think that really helps in sort of breaking, kind of like piercing kind of this sort of veil of who the Palestinians are, who the Palestinian fighters are, what they're trying to achieve, right? And I think that will help us sort of normalize our discussions about resistance, not just in Palestine, but elsewhere. So hold on one second.
The I will give you a short introduction of the Islamic resistance movement Hamas. 87 as a Palestinian liberation movement with an Islamic understanding. And like this movement believes in the moderate and open understanding of Islam. So we in Hamas, we believe in the political diversity and the freedom of thought and belief individually, and we do believe that the fight with this enemy is not a religious fight, it is a political, the political diversity and the freedom of thought and belief individually, and we do believe that the fight with this enemy is not a religious fight, it is a political fight. So this means that we have no issue with any Jew around the world. Again, our issue is with the Zionist enemy, with the occupier who occupies our land in a tank. We don't ask those who are riding the tanks what their religion is, or
لذلك نؤكد أننا ليس لدينا أي مشكلة مع اليهودية كدين ولا مع اليهود كأفراد.
So this is something that we always have to like re-emphasize, that we don't have an issue with Jews or with individuals, and like we do believe in the right of the Palestinians to all of Palestine from the river to the sea. So now, in terms of the political work, we could maybe come to an understanding with other forces within the national liberation movement. We could come to agreements that we could come to certain agreements about like some mid-stage solutions, but like these understandings should not stand in the way of the continuation of the project of liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. So we also believe in the right of the Palestinian people to resist in all methods, from political and popular methods to armed struggle. And all colonized people all over the world have been engaged in armed struggle to fight off their occupation, and we believe that the occupier in its nature is fascist and barbaric, and it uses strength to force its worldview, and it can only be defeated with force as well and strength as well. And so we do believe also like in political resistance and all of that, but again, we must never condemn the Palestinian armed resistance. The way that armed resistance is managed and when it's used, this is a purely Palestinian issue, and no one gets to dictate anything about the Palestinian armed resistance. So this is also something that we see in the West, where they decide who is a freedom fighter and who is a terrorist. So I was in Germany in '86, where West Germany was calling the fighters in Afghanistan to freedom fighters. And then the second the Soviet Union was started to collapse, these same people and these same parties were then condemned as terrorists. So we definitely believe in the armed.
Okay, I just wanted to show a clip because I think it is important to sort of hear that perspective from the Palestinian resistance leadership itself. And so I'm just to end by saying that prior to this part of the video, he talked about how important international solidarity is, right? Because without international solidarity, fascist entities like Israel could get away with much of this kind of like genocidal violence, and called kind of the international solidarity movement in all its forms, right? From basic requests to ceasefire, to support for resistance, to boycott as the second front, right? And then just the last 2 points I want to make is, I'm talking about Israel, but United States is the imperialist power is central to this. They're directly involved in this. And this is just as much their genocidal war as it is Israel's. There's no distinction, right? And just lastly, because I think I didn't get to talk about it, but like just a reminder that the centrality of political prisoners in this struggle, and the critical moment in which, the Palestinian resistance fighters were able to use the power that they gained through their resistance to release some of the thousands of Palestinian prisoners who continue to be, detained and tortured in Israel's prisons. So I'm just going to end it there.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for really laying out the legal basis for national liberation struggle, and importantly, also the moral and ethical duty and responsibility that we have to support them. It's a really critical time in the Palestinian national liberation struggle. And so thank you so much for laying that out so clearly. I do see some folks using the Q&A function, so we'll address questions as they come in and later in the webinar. But just to kind of link Suzanne's talk to the next, the Palestinian people and the Filipino people also face oppression from US-backed regimes and US-funded militaries. Both are examples of the simple fact that wherever there is oppression, there is resistance, and both assert this as both a right under international humanitarian law, but also as a duty to their people. Both are inspirations to other peoples fighting for liberation. So next, I want to introduce attorney Edre Olalia, who has been an activist and people's lawyer practicing pro bono or pro deo human rights and public interest law for 34 years. Attorney Edre is the convener and chairperson of the National Union of People's Lawyers in the Philippines and transitional president and member of the governing bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. I could go on and on with his bio, but I think for the sake of time, Attorney Edre, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me, and special shout out to those here in the Philippines for staying up late. No? And I understand this is webinar is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded later. So I would like to tell the NTF LCAP and the Anti-Terrorism Council and the security sector who are lurking maybe, and we'll play this over and over again, that this webinar is not a call to take up arms. No, it's a webinar to talk about taking up arms in relation to international law. And I'm glad that Suzanne, my esteemed colleague, has spoken before me. And I will be echoing a lot of her points, and my sharing will intersect with the concrete application to the situation in Palestine. I hope by the end of my short presentation, 4 questions can be answered. No? First, what is wrong with armed struggle as a form of response to exploitation, oppression, and repression? Second, is armed struggle legally permissible? Should armed struggle be spoken in whispers or in hushed tones? Third, is the right to resist recognized by the international community and international law for that matter? And lastly, are liberation movements terrorists in international law? Although Suzanne has somehow covered this, but to start with, I'll be talking not only about what we lawyers call the jus ad bellum, or the right or the reasons or justification for war or armed struggle on the one hand, and what we call jus in bello, or the conduct or the way of warfare, which is actually the international humanitarian law. I will be sharing my legal opinion on both scores, no? Academic as it may sound, though it is not really. Let it be loud and clear. There is a categorical recognition, even in international law, of the rights that underpin anti-colonial struggles and the process of decolonization and the legal status of armed movements in international law and the so-called non-state actors involved or engaged in them. As already mentioned, through numerous consistent serial resolutions of the UN General Assembly, the international community firmly recognized the existence of a people's right of self-determination and necessarily, both explicitly and impliedly, the legitimacy of waging armed struggle to secure this right. The said right is mentioned in the UN Charter, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In fact, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, as you all know, also implies the existence of a right to engage in revolution or armed struggle when, in its preamble, the said instrument concedes that human rights must be protected, quote, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse, though as a last resort, to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, close quote. Protocol 1, additional to the Geneva Conventions, as many of you know, the basic instrument of armed conflicts or international humanitarian law, or IHL for short, which is a supplemental instrument that laid out the rules on the conduct of hostilities and the protection of civilians in international armed conflicts. This Protocol 1 contains key articles which effectively expanded the concept of an international armed conflict to include situations, the non-traditional so-called situations in which peoples are fighting against 1, colonial domination, 2, alien occupation, and 3, against racist regimes, all in the exercise of the right of self-determination. So from a legal perspective, Protocol 1 internationalized armed struggle for self-determination carried out by so-called non-state actors. In practical terms, it also meant that other provisions of the Geneva Conventions would now and should be applicable to wars of liberation. Protocol 1 was itself the outcome of earlier developments already mentioned by Suzanne concerning the recognition of the legitimacy of national liberation movements, or NLMs for brevity, and the fundamental right of self-determination, the internationally recognized right of a people to assert itself against the state by any means at its disposal, including the use of armed force. Various UN General Assembly resolutions and declarations, some of which were already mentioned by Suzanne, over the years, categorically reaffirm the legitimacy of people's struggles for independence, territorial integrity, and liberation from such domination and occupation as in Palestine, in the exercise of the basic right to self-determination, end quote, by all available means, including armed struggle, close quote, or, quote, by any means at their disposal, close quote. We can provide you a list of these resolutions later on if you wish. IHL conventions and these international instruments, apart from other parallel documents like the Algiers Declaration of the Rights of Peoples of 1976, and of course the history of people's struggles in many parts of the world from time immemorial, have been construed to have legalized the use of armed means to assert the right to self-determination by NLMs. The use of armed force by NLMs can and must also be recognized as a legitimate means in pursuit of such right to self-determination, not only about or against what we already mentioned, the traditional colonial domination, alien occupation, and racist regimes, but against all other forms of neocolonialism, systemic and systematic oppression, and repression of peoples, or imperialism in all its forms and phases. Since neocolonialism continues to prevent colonized states like the Philippines from fully realizing their independence, the use of armed force in the struggle against such neocolonialism, against such systemic and systematic oppression, and the repression of peoples ought to bring the national liberation movements engaged in it within the scope of international law. Accordingly, the conflicts engendered by such people's struggles are likewise internationalized, while the NLMs involved in these struggles are infused with an international legal personality, having corresponding rights and obligations under IHL. The progressive view which we are advancing is that LLMs have locus standi or legal standing in international law in the context of this struggle of self-determination. The right to self-determination may thus be exercised not only in terms of the traditional forms that we mentioned, but also when there is a consistent pattern of gross and proven violations of human rights amounting to a denial of the people's right to freely determine their or its internal and external political, social, economic status. Therefore, IHL views national liberation movements and their actors as belligerents who are governed by the laws of armed conflict. That is to say, their actions are measured against the necessary requirements of distinction and precaution as to the objects of attack and of the principles of necessity and proportionality as to the means and methods of warfare. Consequently, actions taken by national liberation movements like in the Philippines and in Palestine and elsewhere against legitimate objects of attack in an armed conflict under IHL cannot and must not be treated or labeled as terrorism. Otherwise, it allows such actions to be criminalized under arbitrary or even cynical counter-terrorism frameworks, even though they are clearly valid under international humanitarian law. As consistently incorporated in such existing international instruments on terrorism and human rights, the conduct of the parties to an armed conflict, which is again governed by IHL, is excluded in the definition of terrorism. So having recognized this legal standing in international law and their use of armed force in the context and framework of IHL, these NLM entities and their actors, as well as, and even more importantly, us, those who do not take part or direct part in the armed hostilities, like civilians and hors de combat, consequently have rights to be protected by these instruments, principles, and standards of IHL. LLM and their actors, in some revolutionaries or belligerents, cannot be regarded as terrorists. It is therefore in such context and framework, even in international law, that we can say that one's genuine freedom fighter cannot be another's terrorist. Equally important, if not more significant, is the moral mandate provided by the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Peoples of 1976, or what is known as the Algiers Declaration of Peoples, which explicitly recognize the people's fundamental right to development and, of course, as well as self-determination and liberation. This declaration was, in fact, even clearer and more succinct than the aforementioned UN documents in laying the ground for the rights of peoples, not individuals, against neocolonialism. Among others, it does recognize that peoples have, quote, the right, if they are under subjection, to fight for the liberation, close quote, and quote, to break free from any colonial or foreign domination, whether direct or indirect, close quote. On top of the moral, political, and historical justification already mentioned, the context and framework of the foregoing legal premises now challenge us not to be defensive on the question of the right to resist, not to be defensive on the issue of the right to resist and the option of the use of armed force by the people. It therefore remains a continual call and challenge, in fact, even an exhortation, therefore, for NLMs and the organizations involved in them, or those that acknowledge and respect the basic right to resistance, to assert their legitimacy and standing under international law, and to advocate openly for the continued application and observance of international humanitarian law in situations of armed conflict. In conclusion, what therefore is wrong with armed struggle? Nothing. It is recognized under international law as legally permissible and as a valid and legitimate response in the exercise of the inherent right of peoples to self-determination against systemic and systematic oppression, exploitation, and oppression of peoples. Should armed struggle in the context of international be spoken in whispers, in hushed tones? No. There is no need to be defensive about discussing, about recognizing, about respecting or asserting. And for those who choose so, including from Palestine to the Philippines and elsewhere in the world, from exercising an inherent and universal basic right to resist for the right to self-determination. Thank you very much. Salamat po.
Hey, thank you so much, Attorney Edre, for all that detail. I think just echoing, we who are doing this solidarity work can really be bold in our assertion of the legitimacy of armed struggle for self-determination under international humanitarian law. It is an inherent right, and one that we should be asserting, and that's what we're doing here today with this webinar. And so with that, I do want to once again encourage folks to use the Q&A function. Please go ahead and drop your questions in there if you have any. We have some time coming up for Q&A. But before that, we have another cultural offering, again, from Art for the People in Florida, here in the US. This one is a track called Fight Their Own Wars by an artist named Space Baby. You can find Art for the People on Instagram and also Space Baby on Instagram. So we'll play the video, and as the video is playing, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function.
It started with enslavement of the native population. That's when they got their first taste in. They imported all the workers from the African shores. Rest assured, they inspired race hatred. Making up race, bat the drum and the bass. Black labor formed the basis of a blood-soaked nation. Soon 30 colonies turned an empire. Scots, Irish on the front entertainment. Fast forward to the Spanish and American War, the first worldwide tour for our saviors. Not counting Mexico and Tripoli. Then it was Guam, Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines. What a killing spree, prelude to guns and Aberron, caused capital to slip and slide out of battle zones. A simple ride, many soldiers that died were colonized. A double genocide, welcome to the mind of imperialism. Quite division, blood for profit, white supremacism.
Everybody knows that all the people don't have liberties, all the people don't have freedom, all the people don't have justice, and all the people don't have power, so that means none of us do. Take this country and change it. Turn it upside down and put the last first and the first last.
Let's continue like the struggle unabated. To control the sugar, they then occupied Haiti. What's a little death to collect debt? The Dominican Republic sure paid it. What about the naval bases? For a couple of canals, Nicaragua got invaded. First state inflated. World War I was a one-year wonder, with exporting barriers soon overcome. The sick fucks got pretty worried that the Japanese would give up before atomic bombs struck. They would have nuked another city if they had a chance. Instead they turned and burned Korea into flat lands. Propaganda shifter, implement Hitler's plans. Planted fascists and Greece supply no demand. Let's go on from Laos down to Lebanon, the Congo, Thailand, and of course Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh then approached the bench, struck with the knee that he was told to bend. Agent Orange effects are still horrid for the Vietnamese and not the white tourists. Before the Panthers told the cops what it is, they tried to invade the Bay of Pigs, treated like a game. Less known than not, but just as insane was the Cambodian campaign to rain the hailstones and bombs for a safe zone. Shit, insects and gravestones. So God bless all the time they got the ass kicked. Technology stripped by guerrilla tactics. There's many more events it'll save for a different time. Not enough rhymes to describe all the war crimes.
Hey, thank you, Space Baby and Art for the People. Please continue to drop questions in the Q&A box here. We do have one question for Suzanne. So Suzanne, the question is, I think only the US military industry benefits mostly from the war between Israel and Gaza. So I think there's a question in there, and maybe you can try to address that one.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, certainly the US military industrial complex benefits from this war, right? But I don't think that they're alone in benefiting, I mean, obviously the military industry is benefiting from this war, and the military industry in the US has kind of like this kind of like special relationship with Israel, but also with other countries like Egypt, in which, they have these kind of accounts, these bank accounts in which, money directly goes into accounts that go straight to these military companies. and that are contracted out to send arms. But I think it's beyond the military industrial complex itself, right? I mean, the region is historically and currently of extreme strategic importance for the United States, right? And they really see Israel kind of as a tool in their in protecting their interests, right? And to the point where Israel has really kind of become an extension of like US kind of imperialist expansion in the region, or US imperialist projects for the subjugation and domination of the region. And I think that that's evidenced by different records that like from the Truman administration on, in terms of like how they talked about the strategic importance of the region, and when they started to sort of really see Israel more clearly as helping to sort of like play this role. And not to mention kind of like the current conflict and how much they really are orchestrating this. There's actually a really good article about this by like one of our colleagues and comrades that I'll share, that kind of like talks about this and talks about like the Palestinian resistance, that I think that will be very useful. Just gonna look for it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so next question, and this one is a question to all. How is the counterinsurgency war in the Philippines connected with the genocide in Gaza? So either Suzanne or Edre, whichever one of you would like to take that first.
Zane? Okay. I'm not really a political analyst, but from my perspective, it's part and parcel. These are part and parcel of a global hegemony, no? In every part of the world. No? That's why I said in my presentation, in whatever phase or form it may take, it's basically the imperialist design, no? To protect and advance its interest, no, economic, most especially, and military, of course, no. So whether it's in Palestine, the Philippines, and elsewhere in the world, they can connect. You can connect the dots, no, as part of the continuing unipolar, but it's still being challenged as now by other imperialist forces, no. But at the end of the day, it's really part of this imperialist design.
Right. So, I actually just shared a quote from the article that I thought was really strong, right? So Israel, pound for pound, is the best investment the US has ever made. Israel is the purest expression of Western power, combining militarism, imperialism, settler colonialism, counterinsurgency, occupation, racism, instilling ideological defeat, huge profitable war making, and high-tech development into a manticore of destruction, death, and mayhem. I don't know if people have seen this old clip of Biden when he was a senator making a speech in Congress saying, if Israel doesn't exist, we would have created it ourselves, right? I think I can share that if folks want to see that later, right? Because they're recognizing the role that this design, this entity plays for US imperialism. And as Edre said, it's a global apparatus, right? I mean, there's a connection, like the military industrial complex, as the former question brought up, like they're benefiting from all of this counterinsurgency and all of these wars, right? In former discussions that we've had about counterinsurgency, we talked about the global policing apparatus and how it's all connected with each other, right? And we've had organizations like USAID who's helped facilitate that global militarized sort of like police force, right? And yeah, and then, the strategic aspects of all this, I mean, their control of like whether, of the flow of capitalism in the region, their ability to maintain their bases in the region, that's also directly connected to like their ability to like to continue to be an aggressor and challenge the Asia Pacific, right? So it's there are so many connections, but I guess like, maybe as I said, we can actually get some like real political analysts to look further at those.
Great, thank you. Next question, and this is for everyone. What are the limitations of international courts in terms of holding the US government accountable for its war crimes? And I'm thinking that this is war crimes that are committed by the US or by US backed and supported regimes. And what does that then imply for the weight of the findings of People's Tribunal? So that's for everyone.
I'll take the first crack, Suzanne, if you don't mind. Well, there's abundant evidence that traditional bourgeois legal or juridical forums have limitations. First of all, they start from the perspective of those in power, no, in the world, no. For instance, to be very concrete, in the ICC, how come it was so fast to issue a warrant of arrest against Putin in so short a time, but compared to the Palestinian communication, which was filed way back, still at the level of the prosecutor, or even in the case of President Duterte, how come it's still at the level of the investigation, and why is it for some reason it's mostly, if not all, being hailed to the ICC are from individuals of color, no, from Africa, no, but not Rumsfeld, but not Bush, not those people who were guilty of even more horrible atrocities. In the ICJ, there's also the problem, the International Court of Justice. There's also a problem of enforceability, no. Well, they can come up with advisory opinions. Well, of course, we're not trying to undermine, no, the value of course, also of the moral impact of any finding against a violation of international law like genocide. But at the end of the day, how do you enforce this? No, in fact, even in the ICC, how do you arrest people who are supposed to be hailed to the Hague? No. And of course, there's this bias, no, against national liberation movements. We have to really take that into account. It's always from the perspective of the states. That's why I use the term non-state actors. No, IHL, in fact, was directed to govern behavior between the traditional state actors. It was only an evolution of the phenomenon of liberation movements in the 70s that compelled the international community to recognize even this other form of armed struggle. No? So there are many limitations. Of course, there are practical limitations, but and there are also clusters of interest. No. I could even it's not juridical, but even in the council itself of United Nations, there are clusters, voting clusters there. When there's a resolution, you can already predict which group of states would side in one state or the other. No, so the political factor is always there. It's not a objective standard by which, for instance, even the United States, they're very good at invoking human rights when it does not apply to them. But when it applies to them, they look the other way. You know, So even the regional formations, the regional juridical formations, there are also limitations, like the one in Luxembourg, for instance, and in Strasbourg. We have seen how movements have been labeled as terrorists, and they have been sustained. No? Of course, there are also exceptions to the rule, and that's part of the pushback. So generally, it's always a challenge. That's why People's Tribunal play a very important role as an alternative platform or forum, if not to supply, if not to supplant, but to present a different perspective from the point of the people, not from the point of view of those in power around the world. I'm sorry no, but my point is, there are limitations, but it's also foolhardy to say that they have no value at all. No, no, no. That's going to be, that's something that should not be our view about even this bourgeois. In the United States, for instance, the CCR filed, no, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a case against President Biden with open eyes, and I understand, Suzanne, it was dismissed on the political question doctrine, no? Even if the court in California said, oh yes, there may be prima facie on its face indicators of genocide and the complicity of the US, but it's a political question. So that's where, but the value remains, because you keep on pounding and pounding and pounding. Cumulatively, there will come a time that the exception will become the general rule.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Edre, and yeah, that actually the case is being appealed. The case against Biden and Blinken, and I think that they're using the ruling, the judge's ruling, which says that like which matches the ICJ's ruling, saying that there's ample evidence of genocide, as a way to try to challenge that political question doctrine. But I agree. I mean, I think that like I mean, on the one hand, these courts are continuing to protect imperialism. They're continuing to reinforce, imperialist agendas, whether we're talking about war or we're talking about economics, right? But we can't underestimate really the importance of South Africa bringing the case to the ICJ, and this kind of how it helps this kind of reemergence of internationalism, and how even the unenforceable opinion is kind of like an opening for states to act, to say, based on this opinion, we're going to stop sending arms to Israel, even though more states need to do that, but I think it just also shows, I mean, with the tribunal, like I've been kind of engaging in many types of tribunals, including a farm workers tribunal coming up, and there has to be organizing that happens after the tribunal, right? I mean, there's something very powerful about whether it be federal cases, international cases, or people's tribunals, in which they create a historical narrative, right? Like the Biden, I watched the live stream of the Biden case, and the witnesses were extremely powerful. And it was like extremely, extremely powerful to have the narrative of the Palestinian people being told in a federal court, right? Or at the ICJ, and like, when China got up and defended Palestine's right to resist under international law in the Hague. I mean, that was very powerful, right? But there also has to be a movement with the people's tribunals. It has to be a movement that then moves forward to like reinforce kind of what the vision of that tribunal becomes, right? And so I guess that's why it's important to kind of why I wanted to like talk about the law, but then show this clip from an actual resistance leader, right? Because we can't have one and the other. Like these, I think we have to look at the resistance movement, like as the compass, like the liberation movement itself as the compass, and then the law is the tool. And sometimes that tool is to protect us, right? Because if we want to talk unapologetically about resistance, the law protects us in our ability to do that. And it's also a place to sort of like bring the political demands, or but it can't, but it still continues to be very much kind of a tool that is like reinforcing this imperialist world order. So it can't be done whether it's the ICJ in The Hague or a federal court or a people's tribunal. It's gotta simultaneously exist with resistance movements on the ground, whether we're talking about the Philippines and Palestine or just talking about like workers' movements themselves.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because yeah, understanding that the law is this tool that we can utilize, but what's really decisive is this mass movement of people and their resistance movements. So thank you for that. Eevee, did you want to add anything on the IPT?
I think, yeah, very comprehensive answers by Edre and Suzanne. Thank you for that. And I think linking it back to the previous question as well, that like one of the big links as well between Palestine and the Philippines is that there's these strong liberation movements happening there currently that are actively challenging this imperialist system. So that's also why they are being so heavily attacked, because the people actually are rising up and fighting for the right for liberation. So I think keeping that in mind, it really needs our movement as well to comprehensively support them and see this tribunal as one of the avenues to do that, and to continue building the solidarity movement that supports these liberation struggles in all aspects.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next question. We have time for at least one or two more. This question for Edre, you mentioned that those who are involved in national liberation movements should not and cannot be declared as terrorists. And so how do you view the Philippine government's push to forward terrorist tagging of revolutionaries? And I think we can actually take that from Edre also over to Suzanne, specifically regarding Palestine and the terrorist tagging of liberation movements there as well. But maybe we can start with Edre.
Well, it's totally wrong, no? For all the reasons that you already mentioned, because they should not be regarded as such, because both in terms of the reason for waging a just war of liberation, and also for reasons of complying and respecting international humanitarian law. For instance, concretely, no, as a as a disclosure, I'm one of the legal consultants of the peace negotiating panel of the NDF. But I know certainly from my exposure to the literature, the discussions as a lawyer, they represent the political authority of a people fighting for democracy and independence and freedom, willing, ready, and able to comply with the laws of war. They have the responsibility and accountability if there is any violation or allegation of any violation, that they are waging this war of liberation not for personal reasons, but for a higher reason of liberating people from oppression. No? So it's totally wrong. But the trick here is what standard do you use? Well, of course, the Philippine government is going to use the standard of the anti-terrorism law. That is why the presentation is in the context of international law or international humanitarian law. And that's why the critique precisely is that you don't use the lens of domestic law in treating actors of national liberation movements, because it can be arbitrary, it can be abused as they are, and it does not comply with the standards. Even the United Nations Special Rapporteurs have already spoken against the anti-terrorism law, no, because it does not comply with the standards. And in fact, no, many of you would probably know that there is no law against terrorism. There's no international law. It has not been defined. Unlike genocide, unlike crimes against humanity, unlike violations of but terrorism has not been defined by in other words, it can be subjective and arbitrary and abused by the state in power. So it's totally wrong. It's totally wrong. Absolutely.
Anything to add, Suzanne, to that?
Yeah, I mean, I just say that, like, the framing of resistance and like our movement here in the United States as terrorists has like reached the level of absurdity. You know what I mean? To the point where, after 9/11, there was a time when people really would then believe that label, and I think that framework has become increasingly meaningless to the public, right? Because I think that they're seeing the level of absurdity of which is being used. Like, they're saying that, like, chanting the words "Free Palestine" is supporting terrorism. Like, but like, I mean, it into the way that they kind of are throwing the accusation of terrorism against all kinds of resistance in the United States, not just in relation with the Palestinian movement. But I think it's interesting. I mean, recently, the Center for Constitutional Rights in a U.S. organization called Palestine Legal published a brief report on the origin of anti-terrorism law in the United States, and how it actually has its origins in the U.S. government trying to counter support for the Palestinian struggle. I mean, in the 70s, there kind of was a growing movement coming from within the Arab American community in the U.S. To support anti-colonial resistance in the Arab world, whether it was in Palestine or like it was in Yemen or like, and that kind of became the concern of the Nixon and Reagan administrations. And the very first sort of anti-terrorism policies and legislations were really developed around trying to counter that support for Palestine. And I can share that report if folks are interested. I think that's an interesting history to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think any resources that you can share in the chat, please, by all means. Eevee, anything to add on that?
The red tagging specifically, or
Yeah.
I think just also very important for us, outside of the places where the struggles are happening, to really support that assertion that they have the right to fight for liberation. And also, I think a lot of times, like the red tagging, terrorist tagging, are used to kind of justify the counterinsurgency efforts. So also by our governments, like for example, the US government or the Dutch government, for them to send arms to the fascist regimes in for example, the Philippines, they will also use that terrorist tagging as the justification for that. And I think I also really appreciated Edre's point earlier on that we don't have to be hush-hush about talking about armed struggle, but we should actually assert that also we have the right to support these people that are fighting really for their liberation and for a just and lasting peace. The millions of landless peasants in the Philippines who are fighting for their right to live in peace, that we assert that they have that right, and also that we have the right to support them in that.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for just one more probably. This one is the question to an earlier question related to an earlier question on the global imperialist project. So how to explain the unconditional support of other countries like, for example, Canada, of Israel's continued occupation and genocide against the Palestinian people. And I think that could really just be opened up to anyone. So it's on the unconditional support of imperialist countries.
Well, it's referring to Canada, right? And like, I kind of see Canada as invested in the imperialist world order, even though they're not necessarily the leading imperialist projects in the way that like the United States is, so and it's similar not just for like their lack of criticism of Israel or support of Israel, but like how did they act during the Iraq War? How did they act during the Afghanistan War? Like how how are they acting? How do they act with the Guantanamo? Like, you know what I mean? And like the rendition from they're just as Canada is a country that is part of the capitalist world order and is just invested in maintaining the imperialist world order that is there. There are a lot of folks that want to say that like, okay, we know that the Zionist lobby is very strong, but I think that is like misleading to think that that's what's driving the US investment like in the subjugation and genocide of the Palestinian people, right? Because obviously it kind of impacts, like the Zionist lobby kind of impacts it a lot. And when I say Zionist lobby, I don't just mean Jews, I mean like Christian Zionists and like other, but I think that we can't we can't kind of lose sight of like what this is all for.
Yeah, thank you. Anything to add, Edre or Eevee? No? Okay.
I think
Maybe
just
oh, go ahead.
maybe
Yeah.
just very shortly, I think what is also very good to see is that there's these large movements that are based in Canada, based in the US, based in other capitalist or imperialist countries that are actually supportive of these people's struggles. No, it's really the ruling class in those countries that are determining the imperialist agenda as well and keeping those wars funding at the cost of also the people in their own country.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we do have time for just one more. This question, it says primarily to Edre, but others can answer too. Curious to know how IHL has been used by Israel and the reactionary Philippine government against these armed national liberation movements. If there are any similarities there and what we should watch out for with how IHL is used for their propaganda.
Well, as far as the Philippines is concerned, the Philippine governments, not only the present one, have cynically used the rhetoric of observing the laws of war. In fact, it even has legislated a so-called domestic IHL law. But in practice, that domestic IHL law is being used against the people who are resisting, to suppress the basic right to liberation. So they have broadcasted that the army, the police have undergone a lot of seminars and trainings. Foreign governments, including Canada and many European countries, have invested a lot of resources in joint programs about human rights and IHL. But what is the reality on the ground? The reality on the ground, and that's going to be established with proof and evidence in the upcoming International People's Tribunal, that there are continuing gross violations, not only of human rights, but also of IHL in the context of the ongoing armed conflict. No, it's more of the rhetoric on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's using the very law that should be protecting people against them. No, filing false charges, violation of IHL. We know a lot of friends and clients of ours. The default charge now is not only a violation of the anti-terrorism law, but also the default charge now is violation of IHL. And that has been proven time and time again over the last months or so. Yeah. But for Palestine, I think Suzanne is more competent than I am, except that as an observer, I've heard also that Israel government is saying that, oh, no, we're protecting civilians, that we only target legitimate military objects. No, so I don't know if I'm saying if my perspective is accurate. No, that it's also being used, no, as a mirage, no, so to speak, to cover up what in reality are vicious, horrible violations of human rights and IHL, especially against civilians. Because for everybody who is here, IHL is more of the protection of civilians more than anything else. The protection of combatants and those who have ceased to take part, while important, does not even come close to the protection of civilians who are defenseless. No? So that's what's happening in Palestine, and Israel is using that in a cynical manner, in a dishonest manner, as a matter of fact, no, because the facts are staring us right before our eyes, before the ICJ, before the independent media, before the all accounts, no, even the dominant media, they cannot escape, no, showing the atrocities, no, because it's a reality that is there, that cannot be covered up for a long time. I'm sorry, Suzanne, if I preempted whatever you wanted to say.
No, it's okay. I think you're right. I mean, I think that they have, like, from time to time, like, thrown different sound bites saying that, like, oh, look, we're giving aid, we're doing this, but, like, there's always something that's contradicting what they're saying. Like, and even the Western media is starting to be like, but but, like, I have this video. You said you didn't shoot at them, but we have this video. Like, even the Western media is starting to kind of be like, what are you saying? What's going on? Like, but I think in terms of, like, like, I'm not an expert in this, but I think that the Israel would want to avoid kind of going to court to say that Palestinians are violating IHL, because they'll always lose. Like, if there's actually an investigation, there's actually they're going to lose. I mean, and so I think, like, with this terrorism approach, they're trying. One of the usefulnesses of this framework of, like, terrorism and terrorists is to try to put people in this, like, this zone where the law doesn't apply, right? And, like, a lot of what you can imply from what Israelis have been saying, and even Israeli supporters in the United States, even celebrities, right? Is that, yes, it's genocide, but they're terrorists. So you need to allow us to engage in it. I mean, that's basically the message that they're saying. You need to allow us to continue. It might be genocide, but they're terrorists, like, and they're all guilty of supporting terrorism. So, like, I mean, and that's basically what they're saying. So it's like, so they're creating this sort of, like, zone in which law doesn't exist, like, and it's not just Israel that does that, like, and that's the tool of the terrorist framework.
Okay, thank you. So I think that may have been our last question for today, also for the sake of time. I do want to just offer for any closing remarks from any of our panelists, before we go to some next steps and closing out.
Well, we've said a lot already, but except to say as a last note that there's a time for everything, no? The people will win, ultimately. History has proven that tyrants, dictators, colonizers will fall over time. It's just a matter of time, but the people will win, ultimately.
Just echo that.
Okay, Eevee, anything else to add to that?
Oh no, sorry, that was a perfect ending. I'll leave
Okay,
it
yeah,
again.
that's great. The people will win. There is a time for everything. And so with that, I think we can close out a few things that we do want to leave everyone with who joined us today. First of all, a big thank you to everyone who joined us from all over the globe, actually. This is really an incredible showing of support and solidarity. We are doing some fundraising for the International People's Tribunal. And so you can go to this link, tinyurl.com/donate-IPT, and donate anything small or large to our efforts for the International People's Tribunal happening in May. A few last things. Please save the date for March 18. There will be a hybrid seminar focused on human rights, co-hosted by ICHRP, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, Europe, and Viva Salud. So that's happening on March 18. And then on April 24, the anniversary of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, there will be some celebrations probably all over the world, and I'm sure some hybrid options there as well. So please save that date as well, April 24. Once again, thank you so much to our incredible panelists. What an honor it is to have been able to moderate this today. Thank you so much. And with that, I think we can close out. So long live international solidarity. Join us in our upcoming activities, and we will see you all very soon. Thank you.